In the grand chronicle of World War II, the story of Trent Park might seem small, a quiet country estate far from the thunder of the front lines. Yet within its calm rooms and over its dinner tables unfolded one of the most quietly decisive victories of the war, the triumph of discipline over hatred, of intelligence over brutality. The image of German generals, men once feared across continents, calmly eating steak under the watchful hum of hidden microphones, is more than irony. It is civilization proving its strength. The Allies had every reason to seek revenge, every justification to mirror the cruelty their enemies had inflicted. But they did not. Instead, they chose a different path, one guided by restraint, patience, and the unshakable belief that morality itself was a weapon. The lessons of Trent Park endure not because of the intelligence it produced, but because of what it revealed about humanity. Power, when unchecked by conscience, consumes itself. And mercy, when shown to the undeserving, can expose more truth than punishment ever will. When the last microphone went silent and the generals returned to their shattered homeland, the war was over. But the meaning of victory had changed. It was no longer measured by the number of tanks destroyed or cities conquered. It was measured by how much of one's humanity remained intact after the fighting stopped. Trent Park's story reminds us that civilization is not built on vengeance, but on the courage to uphold decency, even in the presence of evil. The steak and sandwiches served to the architects of destruction were not acts of forgiveness, nor gestures of weakness. They were proof that the victors understood something their enemies never had, that true power lies in the refusal to become what you fight. In that quiet mansion outside London, amid laughter, guilt, and the soft clatter of silverware, the final victory of the war was won, not on the battlefield, but at the dinner table. In the weeks following the German surrender, the barbed wire fences around Trent Park began to lose their meaning. The prisoners within no longer needed guards to remind them of defeat. The silence that had once filled the estate was now replaced by the rustle of papers, the turning of pages as Allied officers reviewed thousands of transcripts gathered over the previous years. The British intelligence services had collected one of the most remarkable archives of the entire war. Over 100,000 pages of secretly recorded conversations. Every confession, every careless boast, every word uttered between mouthfuls of food had been transcribed, indexed, and analyzed. What had begun as a social experiment had ended as one of the greatest intelligence victories of the 20th century. The intelligence legacy. Revelations from Trent Park reshaped the Allies' understanding of the German military machine. Analysts now knew the truth of what the generals themselves had suspected, that Hitler's command system had collapsed into chaos by 1944, that crucial military decisions were made through fear rather than logic, and that many German officers had knowingly participated in war crimes while hiding behind the illusion of obedience to orders. From these transcripts, Allied planners built a psychological map of the defeated Reich. Who could be trusted in the reconstruction of post-war Germany? Who was irredeemable, steeped in ideology and fanaticism? Who could be useful in the coming Cold War confrontation against the Soviet Union? The material from Trent Park directly influenced the denazification process and post-war intelligence recruitment. Some of the generals, particularly those critical of Hitler and the SS, were quietly approached in later years to offer insights into Soviet military doctrine and strategy. Others, whose guilt ran too deep, were transferred to Nuremberg to face justice. It was a delicate balance, justice and pragmatism often colliding in the early years of peace. The human consequences for the German officers themselves. Captivity had changed them in ways they could not fully articulate. Many were released between 1946 and 1948. Returning to a homeland unrecognizable in its ruin. Cities like Cologne, Dresden, and Hamburg lay flattened. Millions were homeless. The old certainties of military honor and nationalist pride had evaporated. Some of the generals wrote memoirs, often attempting to rehabilitate the image of the Wehrmacht. They portrayed themselves as professional soldiers, distinct from the Nazi regime, a myth that would persist for decades. But the Trent Park transcripts, when declassified many years later, told another story. They revealed arrogance, complicity, and, at times, chilling indifference. Still, a few underwent genuine transformation. General Dietrich von Choltitz, who had refused to destroy Paris, became a symbol of pragmatic decency, proof that even within the regime, moral choices had existed. Others, like von Thoma and Eberbach, lived quiet lives, haunted by memories of what they had seen and said in captivity. To many, the steak dinners had become a bitter irony, reminders of a time when the victors had shown more humanity than they themselves ever had. The moral reflection within British and American circles, the Trent Park experiment sparked debate for years. Some officers believed the humane treatment had been too generous. Others argued it was proof that ethics and effectiveness could coexist in warfare. Major R.V. Jones, one of the intelligence officers who monitored the operation, later wrote, "We discovered that the truth is best extracted not through fear, but through comfort. When men speak as guests rather than captives, they reveal their true selves." That philosophy would echo through modern intelligence operations for decades, influencing interrogation standards, POW treatment policies, and even Cold War psychological tactics. The broader world never knew of Trent Park's success during the 1940s. The operation remained classified for over 50 years. To the public, the idea of German generals being served steak during rationing still sounded like moral betrayal. Only in the 1990s did historians uncover the true scale of the deception, that the comfort had been a calculated weapon, and the microphones a silent instrument of justice. By the time the gates of Trent Park finally closed as a POW camp in 1948, Britain had already moved on to a new kind of conflict, the ideological shadow war with the Soviet Union. But for those who had served in its halls, the memory lingered. The hum of hidden wires, the faint echo of voices through walls, and the knowledge that civilization had prevailed not only by force of arms, but by force of principle. When the last German prisoners left Trent Park in 1948, the estate returned to silence. The chandeliers were cleaned, the listening equipment dismantled, and the heavy oak doors locked. What had been a stage for one of history's most extraordinary intelligence operations was, once again, just a quiet English country house. Yet the echoes of what had happened there continued to shape the moral and political order of the post-war world. The hidden archives, the POW, tens of thousands of transcripts, marked most secret, were sealed and stored in government vaults. Only a handful of intelligence officers and historians within MI-19 and the War Office knew of their existence. Decades later, when the documents were declassified, they stunned researchers. They revealed the candid words of men who had commanded armies and shaped the Third Reich. The generals' conversations laid bare their delusions, rivalries, and moral blindness. Many still justified atrocities under the banner of military necessity. Others, stripped of propaganda, admitted regret and disbelief at the magnitude of the crimes committed under their leadership. One transcript recorded a general confessing, almost to himself, "We marched under banners of iron, but our souls were made of clay." These documents became invaluable to historians, dismantling the long-held post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht. For decades, West Germany's military tradition tried to separate itself from Nazism, portraying the regular army as a political and honorable. The Trent Park recordings shattered that illusion. They proved that complicity in war crimes extended far beyond the SS, that the Wehrmacht's leadership had been fully aware of, and at times participated in, the machinery of destruction. Through these voices, history finally spoke truth to power, not with outrage, but with evidence. The broader ripple effect. The legacy of Trent Park extended well beyond intelligence work. It became a case study in psychological warfare, shaping how future conflicts would be fought. Not just with bullets, but with ideas and perception. During the Cold War, British and American interrogators drew lessons from Trent Park's success. The principle was simple but revolutionary. A comfortable prisoner is an open one. Fear produces silence. Respect produces words. The humane treatment of captives became a cornerstone of Western intelligence doctrine, contrasting sharply with Soviet methods of coercion and torture. In an age where ideology defined global power, the Allies' wartime restraint became part of their moral arsenal. The microphones of Trent Park had captured more than voices. They had captured the moral difference between dictatorship and democracy. From prison to Cymbeline, the decades after the war, Trent Park fell into obscurity. The house passed through various hands: a teacher training college, a community center, and eventually, a heritage site. Few of its visitors realized that its walls had once listened to the conversations that helped expose the Nazi command's crimes. In 2019, British historians and preservationists campaigned to restore the mansion as a museum of wartime intelligence. When the archives were displayed publicly for the first time, visitors could read the general's words as they were spoken, unfiltered, unrepentant, or uncertain. Standing in those rooms, one could almost imagine the clinking of cutlery, the low murmur of voices, and the faint buzz of the hidden wires that had changed the course of justice. Trent Park had become more than a historical curiosity. It was a moral monument, a reminder that victory in war is not only measured by battles won, but by values preserved. The irony of mercy, perhaps the most haunting legacy of all, is the moral irony at the heart of the story. The same officers who had overseen campaigns of terror, scorched earth, and enslavement were, in the end, treated with dignity. They were given bread, then steak, interrogated, but never tortured, fed, even as their victims starved. And yet, through that very mercy, the truth emerged. Their words condemned them far more powerfully than cruelty ever could. When one reads the transcripts today, there is an inescapable paradox. The victors who fed their enemies had already won more than the war. They had won the argument for civilization itself. In the quiet aftermath of the world's most devastating conflict, Britain and the United States had demonstrated something profound: that strength need not be cruel, and justice need not be loud. Sometimes it is enough to set a table, serve a meal, and let the guilty speak for themselves. From that lesson would grow a new kind of warfare. One fought not with fear, but with understanding. And from the ruins of Europe rose a new promise, that even after the darkest acts of man, decency could still prevail. By late 1944 and into the early months of 1945, the operation at Trent Park had evolved from quiet surveillance into one of the most revealing psychological studies of the Nazi command. What had begun as an experiment in humane intelligence had now become a mirror held up to the defeated German mind. Every evening, as dusk fell across the manicured lawns of the estate, the captured generals gathered in small groups around dining tables or in the lounge, puffing on cigars, their uniforms replaced by neatly pressed civilian suits. Servants poured wine, and the clinking of cutlery mixed with the low murmur of conversation. What they did not know was that every word, every boast, every sigh of regret was being captured and transcribed below their feet. The microphones picked up the first true cracks in the myth of the German military elite. It began innocently. One evening, General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, the same man who had commanded the Afrika Korps after Rommel, spoke of the Eastern Front. Between mouthfuls of food, He confessed to General Ludwig Kruvel that the Wehrmacht had known of the massacres of civilians and prisoners by the SS. "Of course we knew," he said quietly. "But one does not speak of such things when orders come from above." That single conversation, recorded by British intelligence, became one of the first internal German admissions that knowledge of atrocities had been widespread among senior officers. The myth that the Wehrmacht had been clean, separate from Nazi crimes, began to crumble, years before historians would expose it in full. The transcripts were sent directly to MI-19 headquarters, where analysts under Colonel Robin Stevens recognized their magnitude. These were not coerced confessions. They were natural speech, unguarded, candid, damning. Over the next weeks, dozens of similar exchanges surfaced. Generals reminisced about partisan cleansing operations in Belarus and Ukraine. They spoke of Soviet prisoners starved in camps, of villages burned under orders, of necessary brutality. Every line was typed and archived. Every phrase, a nail in the coffin of moral denial. And yet, the atmosphere upstairs remained civil. The officers continued to dine, unaware that their own words were preparing the groundwork for their future trials. The second shock, Hitler's decline in early 1945, new arrivals brought rumors from Berlin. Among them was General Dietrich von Choltitz, captured after surrendering Paris intact in defiance of Hitler's orders. He was joined by General Heinrich Eberbach, who had served under Guderian on the Eastern Front. During one recorded evening, the two men discussed the Führer's condition. Von Choltitz described his last meeting with Hitler, noting trembling hands, rambling orders, and a face gray and drained of reason. "He has lost touch with everything," he said. "The Reich is no longer ruled. It is collapsing from the top." Those recordings reached London weeks before the final fall of Berlin. For British intelligence, they provided not only confirmation of Germany's impending defeat, but a psychological portrait of Hitler's unraveling mind. In a world where radio broadcasts still painted him as defiant, Trent Park's microphones revealed a man isolated and broken, surrounded by yes men, too afraid to speak the truth. The third shock, secrets of German technology. Perhaps the most strategically valuable intelligence to come from the dinner tables involved Germany's weapons programs. In one conversation between General Eberbach and Colonel von Lossberg, the two discussed new rockets that fly to England without pilots. They were referring to the V-1 and V-2 programs being developed at Peenemünde. This conversation, recorded months before Allied intelligence confirmed the full extent of the rocket program, led to targeted reconnaissance flights that eventually uncovered launch sites along the French coast. In another exchange, generals bragged about armored monsters under construction, super-heavy tanks like the Maus, and aircraft capable of near-sonic speed. Some of these projects, later found in captured factories, astonished Allied engineers. The irony was profound. The most advanced German weapons had been betrayed not by spies, but by generals sipping tea over dinner. The emotional breaking point, by April 1945, as Germany crumbled and Hitler's suicide became imminent, the mood at Trent Park shifted. Gone was the arrogance of the early months. The generals grew quiet, reflective. Some refused meals. Others stared silently through the windows at the English countryside, green, peaceful, untouched by the devastation they had unleashed across Europe. One officer, General Georg Neufer, who had once commanded Luftwaffe forces in North Africa, was overheard murmuring to himself, "So this is how it ends. Not with a fight, but with a meal." On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. That evening, the prisoners were served steak and grilled sandwiches, an act of quiet irony by their captors. The British officers did not gloat. They simply observed. Some prisoners raised their glasses in solemn resignation. Others, unable to reconcile defeat with dignity, wept silently into their plates. Below them, the microphones recorded the sound of knives cutting through meat, the soundtrack of a fallen empire realizing its mortality. For the Allies, that night marked more than victory. It marked the triumph of principle, that civilization could defeat barbarism without becoming barbaric itself. The night of May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, was unlike any other inside Trent Park. The world outside erupted in celebration. London streets filled with music, flags, and fireworks. Church bells rang through the night. Strangers embraced in the streets. But behind the estate's iron gates, the atmosphere was different. For the captured German generals, the war's end was not liberation. It was revelation. They sat in the same dining hall that had hosted countless meals before, yet something intangible had changed. The once proud officers no longer boasted or argued about campaigns and strategies. Their voices were subdued, their gestures mechanical. The steak on their plates, the same symbol of Allied civility, had become a silent reminder of everything they had lost. As the guards served grilled sandwiches and hot tea, one of the microphones hidden in a ceiling lamp captured a hushed exchange between General von Thoma and General Bayerlein, once commander of Panzer Lehr Division. Bayerlein: "Do you think they'll forgive us?" Von Thoma: "Forgive? No, but perhaps they will understand that we followed orders." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. They did not know that, far below them, every syllable was being preserved, archived for the trials and history books to come. The collapse of pride by dawn. The first light spilled through the estate's windows, illuminating a room of defeated men. The once gleaming medals were gone, but the habits of rank persisted. Chairs arranged by hierarchy, conversations led by seniority. Yet even that structure was beginning to crumble. Generals who had once spoken of honor now questioned their own loyalty. One admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that perhaps the true betrayal had been of the German people, not of Hitler. Another remarked that the Führer's dream of empire had left only ashes and graves. The microphones recorded it all. When analysts at MI19 read the transcripts, they recognized something profound. These men were not merely recounting facts. They were undergoing a kind of moral disintegration. The silence between their words spoke louder than their confessions. For the first time, the German officer corps, once the most disciplined institution in Europe, had been stripped of myth. And what remained was human vulnerability. One entry from the Trent Park archive simply read, "Dinner quiet. Men subdued. No laughter. Some tears." The revelation to the world weeks later, excerpts from these recordings, carefully sanitized and translated, reached policymakers and military leaders in Washington and London. They revealed not only strategic details, but emotional truths. The despair of German officers, their disillusionment with Nazism, and their awareness, often long suppressed, of the crimes committed in their name. This intelligence became instrumental during the Nuremberg trials. British prosecutors, armed with knowledge from the Trent Park transcripts, could anticipate defense arguments and challenge claims of ignorance. When officers later swore they had no idea of atrocities, Allied lawyers already had their words, spoken freely over dinner, to prove otherwise. The gentleman's prison had become a quiet courtroom long before Nuremberg ever convened. A symbolic dinner accounts from surviving. British personnel at Trent Park described that May evening as eerily calm. Guards were instructed to treat the prisoners with dignity, even as the radio announced Germany's unconditional surrender. No taunting, no celebration in their presence. Instead, dinner was served as usual: steak, potatoes, and bread. When one guard placed a plate before Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, he reportedly looked up and asked softly, "And this, too, is victory?" The guard didn't answer, but history would. For Britain, That meal symbolized something far larger than the end of a war. It was the triumph of restraint over rage, of civilization over vengeance. Where Hitler had glorified hatred, the Allies had chosen discipline. Those who had commanded death on a continental scale were now fed, not as equals, but as reminders that humanity, once abandoned, could still be reclaimed through simple acts of civility. Unmasking the generals in the weeks that followed, the British began transferring prisoners to new facilities for debriefing. But the damage to their pride was already done. They had been undone not by interrogation, but by their own humanity, the need to talk, to justify, to be heard. And as Europe began rebuilding from the ashes, those conversations, captured in secret, would help shape the post-war world, the early Cold War, and even the reformation of a new, democratic Germany. The war in Europe was over, but the war for minds had just begun. The generals who entered Trent Park were not merely prisoners, they were the embodiment of a fallen ideology. Men who had once commanded armies of hundreds of thousands now stood powerless in a foreign land. Yet, the British did not strip them of their dignity. Instead, they gave them a mirror: civility. In this reflection, many saw their own contradictions. Around the dining table, where silverware replaced weapons, the conversation shifted from pride to shame. Some, like General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, initially mocked their captor's politeness, calling it British hypocrisy. Dirtied, but over weeks, the tone softened. The comfort eroded their defenses, and reality began to sink in. Transcripts revealed fascinating human moments, generals discussing the destruction of their own cities, the betrayal of Hitler, and the weight of personal guilt. They spoke of the Ruhr in flames, of Dresden burning, of wives and sons lost. The war that had once been fought in their name was now closing around their conscience. One officer admitted quietly over dinner, "We have destroyed our own country. There will be nothing left to lead." The British intelligence officers listening in the basement understood something profound. The war for hearts and minds could not be won through punishment alone, but through reflection. In that dining room, humanity, the very thing Nazism had tried to erase, was being restored, piece by piece, through ordinary gestures: a meal, a conversation, a seat at a table. Behind the calm civility of Trent Park lay one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Second World War. The steak and sandwiches were not rewards, they were tools. The British had long realized that direct interrogation rarely yielded valuable intelligence from high-ranking officers. Trained in discipline and deception, they would resist questions, give false answers, or retreat into silence. But when these same officers felt comfortable, safe, even superior, they began to talk freely, often competing to display their knowledge or justify their failures. Every room was bugged. The British engineers of Mi-19 had concealed microphones in lampshades, wall panels, and even garden benches. Wires ran through the walls to a hidden monitoring room where German-speaking analysts, many of them refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, listened for every word. Through these covert recordings, the Allies obtained information months ahead of traditional intelligence channels. Discussions at Trent Park revealed details of V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, confirming testing sites and development progress, candid admissions of mass killings on the Eastern Front, later verified at Nuremberg, evidence of the Luftwaffe's fuel shortages and morale collapse by 1944, early insights into the internal rivalries between Wehrmacht and SS leadership. The intelligence value was enormous. In many cases, what was said over dinner guided Allied strategic assessments for months. The generals' arrogance became their undoing. Believing themselves among equals, They let slip secrets that interrogation rooms could never have extracted. Perhaps the most haunting question raised by the steak and sandwich story is moral. Why show mercy to men responsible for so much death? For many Allied citizens, especially those who had lost loved ones, the idea was unbearable. British. Tabloids mocked Trent Park Hotel, calling it a gentleman's club for war criminals. American soldiers, living on canned rations, heard rumors that German generals were being served four-course meals and wine. To the public, it felt like betrayal. But within British command, there was conviction that moral restraint was a weapon in itself. The war had exposed how cruelty corrodes the soul of nations. Churchill, though privately furious at Nazi atrocities, insisted that our treatment of prisoners will define our victory. In that sense, Trent Park became a symbol not of indulgence, but of discipline. By offering humane treatment, Britain proved it was fighting for something greater than revenge. Yet, the moral paradox lingered. Some of the same generals who had ordered the destruction of Warsaw or the deportation of civilians now dined in comfort. Their bellies were full while millions starved in post-war Europe. To historians, that contrast remains unsettling. But in those dining rooms, an invisible justice was being served, not through cruelty, but through exposure. Every careless word, every boast, every attempt at denial was quietly recorded, transcribed, and archived. And long after the plates were cleared, those words would resurface in trials, reports, and moral reckonings that reshaped the modern world. Long before the Cold War introduced the era of surveillance, Britain had already pioneered one of the most sophisticated covert recording operations in the world. The entire Trent Park mansion was wired like a living organism. Beneath its polished floors, a maze of cables connected to hidden microphones. Every lamp, every painting, even the ornate plasterwork in the ceilings hid tiny transmitters. These microphones, based on technology developed by the Special Communications Unit, SCU-3, were sensitive enough to capture a whisper through a wall. Down in the cellar, translators monitored every feed through bulky bakelite headphones. Teams worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, typing at clattering mechanical keys. Each conversation was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and filed by officer, rank, and subject. What emerged was an archive of astonishing detail. Nearly 500,000 recorded conversations from German officers between 1940 and 1946. The recordings revealed far more than military secrets. They became a psychological map of a defeated army. From these transcripts, analysts built personality profiles of key officers, understanding who remained loyal to Hitler, who doubted him, and who could be useful in the post-war reconstruction. This approach would later influence early Cold War debriefing techniques and the founding of Western intelligence agencies like GCHQ and the CIA. By offering stake and civility, Britain had discovered a weapon of the future: information. Not through torture, not through fear, but through the power of comfort and human vanity. Beyond the intelligence rooms, the luxury POW strategy created a dilemma of optics. The British government faced an outraged public that saw only indulgence toward the enemy. Newspapers published sensational headlines, "Nazis eat better than Londoners," accompanied by photos of well-dressed German officers strolling through gardens. The truth, of course, was hidden. These men were walking microphones, their comfort a calculated trap. But to maintain secrecy, officials could not explain the operation. Instead, they endured public criticism in silence. Some members of Parliament protested openly. In one heated debate in 1946, an MP thundered, "We treat our conquerors like kings, while our own children drink watered milk." But the government stayed firm. The intelligence coming out of Trent Park was too valuable to risk. Ironically, When the transcripts were declassified decades later, those same critics realized the brilliance of the ruse. The soft power of civility had extracted more actionable intelligence than any conventional interrogation ever had. Propaganda, however, worked both ways. Word of the humane treatment spread into occupied Germany through returning prisoners. For a population fed years of Nazi propaganda about Allied barbarism, the reality that their generals were being treated with dignity came as a shock. That shock had political value. It weakened Nazi mythology and paved the way for post-war re-education. The Allies were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were rebuilding a civilization from the ruins of its own making. The steak and sandwiches were more than food. They were symbols of a different moral order. The intelligence gathered from the gentlemen's prisons shaped not only the war's closing months, but also the entire post-war balance of power. Through captured conversations, the Allies identified officers who might cooperate in rebuilding a democratic Germany. Men like General von Thoma, who openly criticized Hitler's fanaticism, became useful intermediaries. Others, deeply entrenched in Nazi ideology, were flagged for prosecution at Nuremberg. When the Cold War began, only a few years later, many of these same officers, once fed steak under watchful microphones, were quietly consulted or recruited as NATO advisors. The irony was immense. Yesterday's enemies were now strategic assets against the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence learned of the British methods and began replicating them in their own facilities. The idea that comfort can be weaponized became a cornerstone of psychological warfare worldwide. At a deeper level, the policy also had a civilizational message. The British Empire and the United States sought to demonstrate that the rule of law, not vengeance, would guide the post-war order. Their humane treatment of even the worst enemies reinforced the legitimacy of Western values, values soon to be tested in the ideological confrontation with the USSR. And so, a paradox stood at the heart of victory. Those who had waged war for tyranny and brutality were now being used to build the very peace they had tried to destroy. In the dining halls of Trent Park, over plates of food and polite conversation, the foundations of a new geopolitical reality were being laid, one where information, not ideology, would define power. The next phase of the story would reveal how all of this came to a breaking point, when one revelation, caught by the microphones, changed everything. May 1945. The guns of Europe had fallen silent. In a quiet compound outside London, a line of captured German generals shuffled through the gates of Trent Park. Once a stately English mansion, now surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Their medals had been taken, their pistols confiscated, but their posture remained proud, almost defiant. Inside, they expected a cell or a ration of thin soup. Instead, the air smelled of grilled meat. A British officer gestured toward a table lined with plates: steak, buttered vegetables, white bread, and steaming cups of tea. The Germans paused, exchanging confused glances. Some muttered that it must be a trick, a humiliation in disguise. But the guards merely nodded politely. "Welcome, gentlemen," said the officer. "Dinner is served." As forks scraped against porcelain, concealed microphones hidden in lamps and walls began recording every word. The war had ended for them. But a new kind of battle had just begun. One fought not with guns, but with conversations over steak and sandwiches. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from within. The thunder of Allied artillery echoed across the Rhine, while Soviet tanks rolled through the ruins of Berlin. Hitler's empire, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, was reduced to a dying fortress, choked with rubble and despair. Millions of German soldiers laid down their arms, not out of loyalty, but exhaustion. For the Allies, victory brought a new and immense challenge: what to do with the captured enemy. By May, more than 11 million German soldiers were in Allied hands across Europe. Among them were hundreds of senior Wehrmacht officers, field marshals, generals, and staff commanders who had once dictated the fate of continents. These men were not ordinary prisoners. They were the architects of the most destructive war in human history. In theory, their treatment was governed by the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, which required humane handling, adequate food, medical care, and protection from public humiliation. Yet, the practical question remained: how to enforce those ideals amid a world still reeling from the Holocaust, the Blitz, and the devastation of total war? The British and Americans faced an ethical paradox. On one hand, they had every reason for vengeance. Cities like Coventry, Rotterdam, and Warsaw still smoldered in memory. The Allies had liberated camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, where starvation and cruelty defied comprehension. Public sentiment demanded retribution, not mercy. On the other hand, Britain and the United States recognized that the treatment of German prisoners would define the moral legacy of their victory. To starve, torture, or execute en masse would mean descending to the same moral abyss that had consumed the Nazi regime. The war had been fought not only to defeat an enemy, but to defend a civilization built on laws, restraint, and humanity. The solution took many forms. In continental Europe, massive transit camps like Rheinwiesenlager in the American sector were established. Open-air enclosures that held hundreds of thousands of surrendered soldiers under basic conditions. Supplies were stretched thin, and rations were modest. Disease and deprivation were common in the early months of occupation. But for high-ranking German officers, a very different plan emerged. Rather than isolating them in harsh conditions, British intelligence decided to place them in relative comfort, not out of compassion, but out of strategy. In late 1939, the British Secret Service had already begun an experiment. The Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, codenamed CSDIC, and one of its key sites was an elegant Georgian estate in North London called Trent Park. Captured Luftwaffe officers were brought there, lodged in spacious rooms with windows, gardens, and meals far superior to the front lines. What the prisoners didn't know was that the estate's walls were wired with hundreds of hidden microphones. Every corridor, every lounge, every bathroom became a listening post. The British called it Operation Eavesdrop. When the war ended, that same system expanded. Generals from across the crumbling Third Reich, captured in France, Italy, and North Africa, were quietly transferred to Trent Park and similar sites like Wilton Park, Latimer House, and Camp 11 in the United States, Camp Clinton in Mississippi, Camp Ruston in Louisiana. The purpose was simple but ingenious: feed them, flatter them, and let them talk. Behind mirrored glass and hidden wires, teams of German-speaking intelligence officers, linguists, analysts, and historians recorded everything. Conversations about troop movements, secret weapons, morale, and even Hitler's mental state were transcribed nightly and sent to the MI-19 intelligence service. The method worked better than any interrogation ever devised. Over steak dinners and cigars, generals dropped their guard. They boasted, argued, reminisced, and confessed. In the comfort of captivity, pride replaced fear, and words became weapons in Allied hands. For the first time, the victors understood not just how the German war machine functioned, but how it thought. This shift, from brute interrogation to psychological intelligence, would soon reshape the entire Allied approach to post-war Germany and the emerging Cold War. And yet, at that time, few could imagine that beneath the polite clatter of cutlery, microphones were recording history itself. The treatment of captured German generals was not an act of kindness. It was a deliberate psychological and intelligence strategy crafted by the Allies. At its core lay an understanding of human nature, pride, comfort, and the irresistible urge to talk when one feels respected. At Trent Park, the British perfected this art. The estate's grand architecture, its marble staircases, chandeliers, and landscaped gardens, had once hosted aristocratic parties. Now it hosted the vanquished elite of Hitler's army, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, once the commander of the Western Front, Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa, General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, and dozens more found themselves in surroundings far removed from the mud and misery of war. They were not placed in cells or barracks, but in rooms furnished with armchairs, bookshelves, and clean linen. Guards, many of them polite and even deferential, addressed them as Herr General. Newspapers arrived daily. So did meals that would have startled British civilians enduring post-war rationing: roasts, bread, butter, fruit, and, famously, steak and grilled sandwiches. The policy was rooted in a sharp contrast. While the Soviet Union treated German captives with brutal indifference, millions dying in labor camps or on forced marches, the British and Americans sought to demonstrate moral superiority. To win the peace, they needed not revenge, but intelligence and influence. The concept of humane captivity was not new, but the scale and sophistication of Trent Park were unprecedented. Every dining room, every sitting area, and even the gardens were fitted with concealed microphones, tiny listening devices connected by hidden cables to a basement recording suite. There, operators monitored the general's conversations in real time. German-speaking intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees from Nazi persecution, transcribed and analyzed their remarks. One of them, Major R.V. Jones, later recalled, "The Germans were treated well not because they deserved it, but because men who are well-fed talk more freely than those who are afraid." The results were extraordinary. Over 100,000 pages of transcripts were produced from Trent Park alone. The generals, lulled by comfort, argued openly about strategy, criticized Hitler, and even discussed atrocities. Some bragged about the bombing of Warsaw or the starvation of Soviet prisoners. Others revealed despair, acknowledging Germany's moral collapse. It was here, around linen-covered tables and teacups, that the Allies first confirmed reports of mass executions on the Eastern Front, of hidden weapons research, and of Hitler's growing paranoia during his final months in the bunker. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans adopted similar tactics at Camp Clinton and Camp Ruston. High-ranking officers, such as General Hans Kramer and Dietrich von Koltitz, the man ordered to destroy Paris, found themselves surrounded by clean beds, swimming pools, and musical evenings. It was an environment designed to disarm, not degrade. The irony was not lost on the public. Newspaper reports of luxury for the enemy sparked outrage among citizens who had endured bombings and rationing. Why were the architects of aggression being fed steak while British families lined up for bread? Officials responded carefully. "This is not generosity," explained a spokesman for the War Office, "but efficiency. A hungry man lies. A comfortable man speaks." The approach worked beyond expectations. Valuable intelligence continued to pour in, not just about the German military, but about Nazi ideology, chain of command, and the personal psychology of Hitler's officers. When many of these transcripts were declassified decades later, historians were astonished by their candor. The British even found subtle ways to play with emotion. Guards casually left newspapers on tables, highlighting headlines about Germany's defeat or the Nuremberg trials. The generals read them aloud, arguing late into the night. Their debates, recorded word for word, offered a rare glimpse into the disillusionment of a fallen elite struggling to comprehend total defeat. Thus, the bread and steak paradox became more than a moral experiment. It was an instrument of power. Through hospitality, the Allies broke down walls that torture never could.